So I want to start off this session that is about integrated project delivery and the CCDC 30 contract. I'm going to throw out a few buzzwords that I think are related and relevant to this discussion. Collaboration, innovation, a new focus on overall project success rather than individual success, alignment of interests, early engagement, contracting as equals. These are the themes that the integrated project delivery contracts, and specifically the CCDC 30 contract, are bringing to the forefront. So to talk about these themes, I have with me today, on my immediate left, a lawyer practicing here in Vancouver, David Volk. David is a partner with the law firm of Jenkins, Marsman, Logan, a firm that specializes in construction law. To his left is Chris Schuld with the law firm Eiford Partners, LLP. Chris also practices in the area of construction law and will bring a certain focus of insurance and surety to his comments. And on my very far left is Dr. Oliver Jones, who has spoken in this session, in this seminar before, and Dr. Jones is with Ryder Architects. So what precisely brought us to where we are today? And I think some of the things that you have encountered, our colleagues have encountered, that bring us to the discussion of greater collaboration in construction contracts are things like the lack of true collaboration, the focusing on the silos of your responsibility, doing your work, throwing it over the fence to the next person, the lack of trust or respect, and the contracts that are created and that are in use don't treat project participants as equals. The pursuit of self-interest at the expense of project success, and the zero-sum approach to projects. The failure to keep communication open, timely, accurate, and transparent. And the problem solving is not my responsibility, it's someone else's responsibility. I'm just going to kick the problem down the road and solve it at a later time. And finally, the lack of true incentives for value adds to the project. These are all themes that I think are the realities that plague construction projects today. So what I'll do is I'll kick off the panel discussion. I'll stop talking and I'll get my other co-panelists to start talking. But I'll start with the very far left with Dr. Oliver Jones. What I've described is sort of the milieu in the Canadian construction industry. Is Canada, the experience that I've described, is it consistent with what you're seeing overseas, or are we off the mark? What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Paul. I think some of the key challenges to us in the UK at the minute, and I spoke a bit about this yesterday at the Owners Forum, are around really trying to focus. So our key costs that have come to us are the cost of litigation has gone through the roof, and our cost of our insurance premiums since the Grenfell Tower disaster have also gone through the roof, mainly through short-term profiteering from the insurance brokers, I may add. All of this is endemic in the fact that within our industry, we've proven, particularly within the UK, that we just cannot look after our own house. The demise of Carillion, which had a number of issues along the way, they point towards a lack of trust, as you've mentioned, a lack of accountability and responsibility, and overall a lack of transparency in the entire chain. So one of the things that I touched upon yesterday was a real drive from the UK construction industry to pull together a simple, basic set of information that tracks through a project and allows you to evaluate that project based on pre-agreed evaluation criteria, so that we can start to have measures of success on a project. And this needs to almost embrace and take into account some form of digital ledger technology, whereby it cannot be changed, it's there in perpetuity, we know who made the decisions. A lot of the costs that we're incurring as a construction company could sink bigger, smaller companies, because we're spending a lot of time on contracts, trying to find information, trying to understand who made a decision, when the decision was made.
So you're talking about themes, you're talking about the themes of transparency,
yes, absolutely,
and accountability, right?
Absolutely.
Right. Well, let me just pick up on that then and bring it a little bit closer to home in terms of what the theme of this presentation is all about. And that's the CCDC 30 contract. Now, as I look out into the bright lights, I'm going to ask you for a show of hands. Who here has done or been involved in an integrated project or used the CCDC 30? 1, 2, 3, a handful perhaps. Okay, I'm just going to give you a highlights, just a few, very few highlights that pick up on some of the themes that kicked off the discussion with, and then I'm going to turn it back to my other co-panelists. So some of the key features that I think differentiate the CCDC 30 from other forms of contracts and the integrated project delivery, how it's different. First of all, the parties to the contract, the signatories to the contract, are typically the owner, the consultant, and the constructor. And you could also graft onto that the key sub-consultants and the key subcontractors. So all of these parties who had some connection in the contractual framework, the traditional contractual matrix, are now signatories to the contract. So that creates this level of accountability and respect and equality that I think has been lacking. What else do? They try to achieve a certain objective. And that objective is spelled out in the contract itself. And the objective, you might think this is just sort of this soft social science, but the objective is to work collaboratively in the design and the construction process for the project. Now, where do you see that actually spelled out in any other contract? I don't think I've seen that in any other sort of standard form contracts that exist out there. The other thing that makes it different as well is it spells out the teams and the sub-teams that are required to run this project. There is the top level is the senior management team, and they have oversight of the direction of the project, both in terms of its construction and design. Below them is the project management team. They're getting a little bit closer to the construction, and below that is the project implementation team. These are all a set of new acronyms and terminology that you have to learn that we borrowed from our neighbors to the south in the American context. But these teams have individual tasks and responsibilities. And each member of the team is responsible for their task, but they're also responsible for the other members of the team. So the senior management team is made up of a representative of the owner, the consultant, the contractor, and the same as you scroll down into the other levels of the project management. Their task is to create a base program and a base target cost. So what can the designer and the constructor deliver for the owner's budget? And they work collaboratively to make sure that the owner can get the maximum amount of value out of those dollars that the owner has available at his or her disposal. And there's an iterative process that goes on. And the target cost in an IPD context is designed to pinpoint the actual hard cost of that construction of that project. And then everything else is put into a profit pool or an incentive compensation pool. And as the project develops, those hard costs are tracked. And the profit pool, depending on the performance of the parties to the contract, the profit pool is then shared between the owner, the consultant, and the contractor, and those people below them as well, in a predetermined fashion. So there is a schedule to the contract that actually shows how this profit pool will be divided based on the success or failure of the project. The other thing that is important as well, again, there is a waiver of claims. Let's try to keep the litigation to minimum. I told you about the principle of collaboration and trying to resolve problems early. So there's a waiver of claims and a limitation of those claims that are restricted to direct costs and direct damages. And there's also a project policy that's purchased by the team, the project team, that deals with the wrap-up liability, builder's risk, and project E&O. So again, those concepts aren't new, but the manner in which it's being translated into the project, I think, is new. And the fact that there's this pool available for profit sharing that's driven by project success or failure, I think, is novel. So I've touched upon insurance. I want to now engage David Schuld. Sorry, I said David. I'm so sorry, Chris. I'm so sorry. So tell us, from the perspective of insurers and sureties, what are they looking at, and what are the concerns that they have as it relates to IPD projects?
Certainly. Well, to prep this, I thought, some anecdotal work on it would probably provide the most insight, and everything that I was able to glean from the insurance industry was really a natural progression, in that the wrap-up liability policies for British Columbia primarily, they emerged in the leaky condo crisis as a way of getting all potentially responsible parties properly insured, so that way down the road, there's a bag of money for emerging defects. And that's a model, and then the COC, Course of Construction Builders Risk policies, they are also similarly designed to be project-based policies, as opposed to having all 50 sub-trades, plus the general, plus the many consultants, each with their own policy, and when problems emerge, this very, very difficult sort of chase down as well, who might well have a policy that might even be triggered in the event of a problem. So that was a natural rolling out in the insurance world, from pre-existing products that could be plunked down nicely into an IPD project with a CCDC 30. The surety industry, on the other hand, was presented with a challenge, and the word from the Surety Association of Canada is that there is intent work on how to design a bond that would suit an IPD contract, but it is in the works, and it's the collaboration that is the grappling point. I am in an enviable position of being at the very end of a conference here talking about insurance and surety. To make it even worse, well, the real problem with surety is that this is a concept that really emerged in the 1200s, and things got real modern, and that the bond forms really came into play in the 1600s with the Statute of Frauds in England. But here we are anyways, and it is a very it's a very thriving product in terms of the overall value of bond premiums being underwritten and its presence in the construction industry. But that shows that we're talking about centuries of parties not collaborating and parties intentionally operating in silos. And so the sureties themselves, maybe I'll save this for a little bit down the road, just mostly to keep everybody awake, but the sureties themselves are used to taking positions premised upon the facts as between owner and general contractor, and stepping in if necessary to either pay out on a default or perform in a default. So to redesign that system and the way these archaic one-page bond forms are written. That's really the struggle. Is, well, how do you address this collaboration concept that overrides everything on the CCDC 30 when, in fact, the product itself is premised upon owner and general contractor really drawing lines from the get-go and having certain responsibilities and harsh penalties upon default.
So, Chris, I'll just jump in there. You made a lot of good points in terms of traditional approaches, traditional thoughts, traditional contracts having to change to embrace the new. What are you hearing from the insurers and sureties out there in terms of some of the concerns, if any, that they have with this collaboration? Because we understand collaboration as a concept, but we as lawyers, we understand conflict as a concept. I mean, that's what keeps our kids in school. But what are you, if anything, what are you hearing from those players, and how are they approaching these new collaborative ventures? Because that is something that the industry is telling us that they want something different, right? They want to get rid of our involvement at the end and maybe keep us involved more in terms of the planning at the front end. I'll just throw that out to you if you have any thoughts.
Well, there's an interesting twist on the way I would answer this question. The twist is that in the surety industry, it is the underwriters of surety bonds that want to get more product, want to keep themselves relevant in the construction world because, hey, that sells more bonds. These are the same people, however, that are grappling with how to write these things. Interestingly, the positive spin in all of this is that the claim side of the surety world is already operating in a manner that theoretically could pair well with the IPD scenario. The reason is this. I mentioned that the results of a surety bond claim are pay or perform. So on $1 million product, you might have a bond that's worth $500,000, and if a contractor defaults, the surety can just say, well, okay, well, here's your $500. But the perform side is where sureties have really done a really progressive job of solving things. And it's this. The obligation to perform on a surety bond, well, nobody in a surety organization owns a hammer and will finish a job. So how that industry has adapted to it is there is a industry of receivers out there, and receivers have found, especially on bigger projects, that if a contractor defaults, then the best possible approach is to actually use the value, the human capital of the actual people that are there on the job, and step in and either propagate the company that has defaulted so that the person's well into the job can finish it with all of their built-up knowledge on it, and everything that I've heard so far today about the technology that would absolutely fold in. That is the far better scenario than having a different contractor swoop in to take over because of the ramp-up time. So then the concept becomes on an IPD where you have people put into teams. Well, the concept can be either those teams survive in the absence of the persons from the defaulting party who has to get plucked out of the thing because they're not getting paid anymore, or better yet, the surety undertakes through a receiver to ensure that those teams remain intact. So if I am Chris working for the contractor, but I am on the delivery team, and my employer defaults, it's my own personal interest is, of course, wow, this is still my job. I still want to keep getting paid. Let's finish the product. There's a chance for that to happen because that's how sureties have solved some of their problems going forward. And so it's interesting to me, I guess, that the hang-up is at the front end. It's the problem is that there is a mechanism out there to solve the problems, but the problem is at the front end of, well, how do you actually write the bond so that the perform component of the bond obligation can keep an efficient project delivery mechanism in place.
Okay, so sureties and insurers who play vital roles on any construction project, they're starting to grapple or having to grapple with this new concept. That is this concept of this integrated project delivery approach, or the integrated project delivery contract. The industry is telling us that they want something different. They want a change. So my question to David Volk, not Chris, is, does IPD actually deliver on the promises that we think it should deliver? Is it the silver bullet?
Good question for the construction litigator who, if you have that image of the glass, it's got water in it, sort of goes about 50%, and it's is that glass half full, half empty? Well, I'm the half empty guy. I'm a construction litigator. All I see is risk generally, and though I've only been doing this for about 10 years, I've had the benefit of working on one failed IPD project, and I can talk about why. But the reality is, and Paul went through the buzzwords, and I call them buzzwords: collaboration, trust. How can we rethink how we do projects? Wonderful. It sounds great. But when the rubber hits the road, and when does the rubber hit the road? When the money starts to run out. What is it that parties fall back on?
No one's ever experienced that, right?
They fall back on what the contract actually says. Because the buzzwords, they're aspirations, right? We want to collaborate. But as soon as there's a concern that the project is going to run out of money, because the contingency is going to be pierced, or worse yet, the profit pool is going to be pierced. Why? Because you've hit unexpected risk. And we can talk about this, but whenever you're looking at IPD, you have to assess what projects are appropriate for IPD. Projects with low risk profiles are probably more appropriate for it, where the goal of collaborating is to, for example, maximize the programmable function of the location. So hospitals and schools, I think, are very popular because it's very important to design a hospital with better workflows for medication delivery and all that stuff. If you're looking at a project, the one project I worked on that was unsuccessful was it was a run-of-river project where you had major risk on things like geotechnical. So if you don't have, and even if you spend a lot of money on your geotechnical analysis, there's always the risk that what you find in the ground is what is different than what you thought would be in the ground. So, and a geotechnical risk can manifest itself in terms of just destroying your budget. And when your budget goes out the window, all of a sudden the contingency's gone, the profit's gone, and you then have unmotivated contractors, you have unmotivated consultants, and you have a pissed off owner. And so I don't want to scare anyone, but the reality of a IPD project gone wrong is that collaboration goes out the window. And one of my clients, it's a in-house guy at a large Canadian general contractor. And he gave me a really good line. I asked him what his thoughts were on IPD, and he said, well, I tend to think it's a race for the pot. That's what it is, right? It's who can get that money first, who can get their work in first and obtain the money, because as soon as you burn through that money, for whatever reason, if you get outside the envelope, it can create real issues. And this is not just for the contractor side. I tend to work for contractors, but for owners, one of the things that Paul talked about is the waiver of liability. So for an owner, one of the things you're giving up on an IPD project under a CCDC 30 is the right to sue for delay. So if it just so happens that you sign up with a contractor and the project's maybe not going so well, or it's taking a little bit longer, and the contractor, say, swaps out some of their personnel, and you get the B team. And all of a sudden, the project, for whatever reason, is taking longer, 6 months, 8 months longer. And now the contractor is submitting new invoices for their increased overhead, right? Now, listen, we got to be on site for an extra 8 months. These are our hard indirect costs. We're having to incur these. The owner has to pay for those. Those are reimbursable costs and has no recourse against the contractor. And so that's the risk that can manifest with a IPD. So I don't know if that's what you wanted to hear about, Paul, but and I'd love to hear anyone else's experience. If anyone has any comments or questions on that.
We always need sort of the cold shower. Lawyers always have to give you both sides of the coin. But I'm going to pick up on something that you did raise, David, and that is you talked about when a project goes bad, when you get the B team, right? You're drawn into the project, you're sold a project, you're going to get the A team, then you end up getting the B team. And I'm going to toss this question over to Oliver, because you talked to me about this just before we came in today, and the importance of a team. And I think there's some sort of a rating system that you were talking to me about members of the team. And I want you to share that thought with those comments with us, particularly in how it could help projects select the right team.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this movement afoot within UK government to obviously reform the construction industry, and no mean feat. But one of the things that they've come up with is a body, a group of people called the Construction Innovation Hub. They've given them 72 million to establish a new workflow and a new process for the procurement of projects. It's not only the procurement of projects, but it's also the evaluation of success of that project. So at a high level, what this looks like is that at the beginning of a project, if you imagine a graphic equalizer, you'd end up with maybe 20 categories, and you tender for that project. And within each one of those categories, we don't know what they are yet, they're being developed, but they range from environmental health all the way through to social health. You index your own tender proposition at the beginning of the project and give yourself a rating for embodied carbon. You give yourself a rating for things that are more intangible, like educational attainment over a 30-year period, things that we've never had to rate ourselves on before. And you state that as a design and construction team at the beginning of the project in your bid. You're then graded on that and held to it at 3 more stages throughout construction and then 2 stages post-completion. Now, when this was introduced, the big question is, well, so what happens if I just don't do it? Because the problem with a lot of these things is...
Hire a lawyer and you sue someone.
So
you sue everyone.
Good idea.
So the big problem here is that there's with all of this, there's an industry based on compliance and just meeting minimal compliance wherever possible. So it's this move almost inverts that, and it makes it about your reputation. It makes it about your ability to deliver on a job successfully. And the upshot of where's the stick in this is that you will be given a credit rating style system for your business in terms of how you do business, on whether you hit what you said you would deliver at the beginning of a project. That credit rating style system, and this is for government funded projects, so in the UK that's about £15 billion worth of projects annually, but you can very easily see this system, because there's a lot of private players who tender for those jobs as well, moving through into the private market. So you end up basically saying, well, you cannot get on this framework unless you have a rating of X. So that is a radical way of looking at a reform of the UK construction landscape.
So thank you. I'm going to pick up on that. I'm going to toss this out to the audience. I know there was 2 or 3 of you, and you might not want to share or provide an answer, but when you are 2 or 3 of you who have been involved in IPD projects, when you're building or selecting your team, how profound or how precise is that rating system, or do you have a rating system for the members that you want to onboard as part of your team? Is there anyone who wants to share a thought on that? We're all friends. No one's going to record this comment for, well, maybe if there's no appetite, what we'll do, maybe we'll come back to that in the end.
I can share.
Oh, here we go.
I can share a thought. So
Sure.
it's interesting to hear from Oliver in the UK. And I wish the CanBIM would actually hire Oliver to come here and convince the government to bring in similar systems. But in Vancouver, we have a pretty unique circumstance, and that was we're 10 hours from Calgary, and we have the U.S. border. So we have a whole other situation. So when you're picking teams, and I was a trade contractor for putting teams onto job sites for executing for installation, it's not a question about A team versus B team. It's about who is available at this given time. Right? That is the circumstances we're coming up against with here in Vancouver. We have a serious skills shortage, and we're not doing anything about that. The colleges are canceling trade schools. There's no apprenticeship programs amongst the trade unions. Trade unions are getting wiped out. Right? I mean, I'm not necessarily as a business owner, I'm on two sides of the fence with regards to a trade union. But if you go down to the U.S., trade unions, I mean, they're expensive to deal with, but they have training for tradespeople, and they have an unlimited. Well, they don't have an unlimited. They suffer skills shortage as well, but they have a pool, a mechanism for training people to get better at the trades. Here in Vancouver, I haven't been able to find a system on how to actually evaluate people. You get into project management, same thing. There's poor project managers and strong project managers. The older they are, the stronger they are. But you have to. There's so much construction going on here. You don't have the liberty to select an A team versus a B team. You put people on the job and you hope that it's going to work out for the best.
And one comment I'd have on that, and it's I agree with that. I think that's very true. Is a lot of these, like the IPD framework, it relies on this sort of project management team or a senior. Perhaps there's a senior team above that. You see the same thing in like the P3 context, where there's supposed to be these like senior meetings between the executives, et cetera. But people are so busy that the meetings don't happen. And what that means is when the senior people don't pay attention to these projects and fulfill those key roles, contractual roles, it's left to the project managers and the site coordinators who don't have the authority, don't have really the mandate to resolve large problems. And if you're relying on a guy who's overworked, for example, an architect or someone like that, who's overworked, who's already got another project to, be issuing drawings on a proactive and collaborative basis, you're going to have a lot of trouble, right? So I think that's a really valid point.
Chris, I'm going to come back to you. In your preliminary comments, you talked about insurers and insurers having to embrace something new. We've heard talk about that in David's comments and Oliver's comments about, and the gentleman who just raised the question or made the comment about how the impact of that. And one of the things that IPD does, or it's trying to do, is trying to change behavior, change models of or approaches or ways of thinking. And I was thinking about the story of the scorpion and the frog, that there's a scorpion floating in the middle of the ocean and it's about to drown, and a frog comes along out of nowhere, and the frog says to the scorpion, "Jump on my back and I'll swim you to safety. I'll swim you to shore." And it goes fine for a period of time until the scorpion decides to sting the frog. And of course, the frog ends up dying, and as he's dying and drowning in the water, he turns to the scorpion and says, "Why did you do that?" And the scorpion says, "It's in my nature to do that." So is it in our nature, is it in your nature to revert back to traditional approaches, traditional mindsets? And I'm going to change the sort of topic from insurance to more the social science here, because I know you've litigated these types of cases. So is there a real risk that IPD doesn't do what it's supposed to do, doesn't get people to change behavior? Or I'm going to put it the other way, sort of the cart and the horse. What's going to drive that change of behavior? Will a contract do it? Or do we really just need a change in behavior and then the contract just sort of provides the window dressing? Throw that to you.
Sure. I think part of the social science here now, let's all step way outside of our expertise, but it does get into, okay, well, what have we seen? And I think part of that answer comes from what David said about, well, is it the right project for IPD? And with hospitals and schools, what we can say about public interest and high-profile projects is that the Scorpion might have a little bit more accountability the more visible it is. So that Scorpion might behave in that scenario when it's on a grander scale. And I think we've seen that happen in P3s. P3s don't really happen for residential housing, single-family dwellings, but they do happen for massive infrastructure. So similarly then, IPD, I think as a model fits with a grand scale. I was quite struck by the prior presentation in that we talked about there was the comment from the presenter of, okay, well, we can unpack the washroom in this facility in 4 hours, and I thought, okay, can we take some of these concepts and bring it down to the smaller scale? And the example that comes to mind that it demonstrates a true Scorpion scenario. Incidentally, it's I'm opposing a colleague of David's on the case, and it's sort of fresh in my mind. But like an IPD situation, we have a general contractor, and it's just like an old family-run business where it still is the head honcho of the business, and he went in with the developer and used another entity to become a partner in the development, but then that development retained his big project management firm. And so...
Sounds fine to me.
Yeah, brilliant from the outset. But what happened is, and I'll admit, my guy is the Scorpion in this scenario. Now the money is run out, based exactly on subtrade availability and the fluctuations in price because of delays, combined with it was residential, and that fluctuates in Vancouver in wild, wild ways. So he's there now saying, okay, well, on my corporate hat where I am a 50-50 partner in this development, that is down the road and speculative. So I don't even care. I just want my construction company to get paid here. So he is willing to sink the profits of his development that he's a partner in because the first money comes out, and he thinks he has a legitimate claim as the contractor to be paid by the developer that he is a part owner of. So it's an incredible situation, but he has no accountability on this, so he can choose where to attack. And of course, the revelations when he signed this partnership agreement in 2014, I think. Oh, those were great times, handshaking and patting on the back, and they had a beautiful vision for this thing, and lo and behold, the ideal scenario for him now is to squeeze the money and take the hit elsewhere.
Sounds like a traditional approach to me. One of the things I think you're hearing, or you can glean from the comments, is that though this IPD CCDC 30 contract is designed to embrace change, reflects what we're hearing from the industry, it sounds like, and I've got my own personal experience, it sounds like IPD isn't right for every single project, right? It doesn't deliver, I don't think it delivers the promises that it's supposed to make. And in my own mind, I've sort of figured that anything below $10 million, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me, based on my own personal experience. So David, I'm going to turn it over to you. With your experience, what are some of the lessons learned? What are some of the things that, if you are going to engage in the IPD approach, what are some of the warning signs that you should observe, and what are some of the lessons that some of your clients have learned as a result of either project success or, more importantly, project failure?
Well, good. Yeah, that's a big question. But, well, as I mentioned, obviously, you have to assess risk I think, when you look at a project and identify whether or not the project's appropriate. I mentioned geotech risk. But so two big concepts, I think, which cannot be stressed enough is having a good design developed at the outset, and then the second is having a very strong budgeting exercise performed, right? On the projects I've been involved with that have had problems with this, there's the design. You can have problems with the design, and this goes back to how people think in the industry. So the collaborative approach, it sounds great, but are you actually doing it? And what does collaboration mean? I think a better word, perhaps, for people to think about is skepticism. Be skeptical about your partner's work, because it's one thing for if you're the the structural engineer, here's my structural design, and the architect, here's my architectural design, and I know this person, or I don't know this person, but it's a great firm, and so I'm just, that looks good. You got drawings, great. We're collaborating. We're having meetings. We're sharing lunches. It's great. We're all putting out press releases at the beginning of a project. Wonderful. That's not real collaboration. Real collaboration, I think, is being skeptical and asking the difficult questions of those people you're partnering with.
Well, that's the accountability that we heard Oliver talking about earlier.
Paul, can I think this entire scenario is actually very similar to BIM and the reason why we're here. We spend an unusual amount of time as a profession and as a sector putting sticking plasters on problems and creating solutions and creating entire workflows for things that are fixing problem after problem. You're almost like that little boy stood in front of the dam, sticking holes in leaks wherever possible, when in actual fact, what we really need to be focusing on is the fact that we're trying to fix a broken system, a fundamentally broken system in the way that it works. And while we're all, plenty of educated people in here trying to stick fingers in holes and come up with solutions that solve little patches of problems, there's entire tech giants circling around the outside just going, do you know what they're doing? No, do you know what they're doing? I haven't got no idea. Do you want to just get together over coffee and we'll just fix this? And then they just turn up with a solution, and that solution is a fully integrated solution. It's a supply chain. It's control over the whole process. It's got a reliable system that works on bringing skills for the future through the business. I mean, one scheme in the UK that's worked relatively well is an apprenticeship levy on businesses. Every business pays into an apprenticeship levy to then train from one central government pot lots of other people. But as an industry in construction, there's something endemically rotten in the way that we go about business.
Look, don't get started on solving all the world's problems, because that's not in lawyers' self-interest to do that. So I'm going to let David continue on with his rant, because I was just getting going right there. I could just see the red in his cheeks coming out. So I'm just going to come back to you. I was the one that interrupted you. You were talking about a healthy dose of skepticism.
Healthy dose of skepticism.
Right, there you go.
A healthy dose of honesty, too. And especially the design team is one thing, but for contractors, if contractors are working together, you need to really review each other's work, bids, and ensure that everything's in there, because the worst thing that you can have happen on an IPD project is a budget that's not big enough. Not only because it doesn't account for the risks, but there's a hole in the budget. And I've seen that happen on a project, and it's awful. And maybe sometimes that's because someone is, there's only so much money, so we got to make it work, right? Move the shells around. But a healthy dose of skepticism and honesty with each other at the front end is absolutely critical. And if you don't do that, you're just asking for trouble.
Terrific. As I'm looking down at the clock, we are ahead of schedule, and we are definitely ahead of budget. So I will look out to the to the audience if there are any questions, because I could go on here all day, but I don't think you want us to do that. So there's a hand up here, and I'm going to ask you, sir, Robert, I think that is right, to come to the mic.
Come here.
Hi, I'm Robert with Stantec, and the question I have is there enough data out on IDP projects and this CDC 30 that we have feedback? In other words, what success rate have we got so far to date? Have we got any data that tells us a success rate? Is it different from what other contracts are and other traditional methods of contracting?
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to my friends here to my left. There is some data out there, and it varies. There's some good data, and there is some bad data. And I know these gentlemen have some personal comments about that.
The two IPD projects that I have familiarity with, they were not CCDC 30. So they were bespoke, alliance contracting, contracts from Australia or from California or something like that, and not as solid as CCDC.
And no, I don't know. Just in terms of the sheer volume of it at all, what I'm hearing is, people looking at it, and I've frankly haven't personally litigated an actual CCDC 30 or IPD.
That's good news so far.
Maybe that is a good sign, but I think that's more of a young sign of the concept.
Well, if I could just jump in, Oliver. What I've heard is that certainly the American experience, and it's the data, Robert, is coming from one source, one lawyer in the United States who is at the forefront of IPD. The information he's providing is that on many hospital projects, and the last time I heard him talking about this was about 52 or 54 hospital projects in the United States, that the budget, the scope of work was greater than originally anticipated. The budget came in at or below what was anticipated. The project timeline was finished earlier than expected. And on the projects where IPD is used, there's an owner satisfaction survey that is handed out. And the fact that owners played a significant role in the development of the program and had their hands on the project as a whole tended to drive greater end user satisfaction. So that's from the United States. As David mentioned, there are projects in Canada. There are a few that I've heard about where they got more scope than originally anticipated, shorter budget, but those two metrics alone don't necessarily define success. They're important ones for sure, but I'm sure Chris is going to be involved in an IPD dispute at some point. I think we all will be, because as David mentioned, once money runs out, and money always runs out, then that's when we get called. So, fingers crossed that I'm wrong, but I don't think I will be.
I got a question over here.
Okay.
Hi, it's Chantal with the VRCA. Back to social science and the skepticism and honesty. What do you think is holding them back from asking those questions and being skeptical and being honest, but from not in potentially an ego standpoint and a business standpoint, competition, but really think of who is the stakeholder, like who's the client, and in their best interests?
Yeah, well, good question. I think it is learned behavior, right? This is something new for most people, and so it's difficult to try on something new and to just reprogram how you're going to deal with it. When you read about IPD, a lot of it I think is written to benefit the owners, and you talk about why owners really like this type of thing, because they're brought into the process, on a design build or a fixed price contract, the owners, they get to be with their consultants, and they like that, right? And they hear from their consultants. But on a IPD project, everyone's working together, and I think the owners can really like the extent to which they really get involved in shaping how the project comes together, and it can be major benefits for them. Just hopefully the budget and everything else works out. But so that I think there's massive upside to it, but I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I think in terms of what's holding
Yeah.
people back from being skeptical, like why aren't they asking the questions? Like, why aren't they being forthright,
Yeah.
coming and holding their cards close?
Well, if you're asking a room full of Canadians, why aren't they more honest with other design professionals? And the system, the way the system's set up, right? Especially on the consultant side, if you're dealing with registered professionals on projects, they're the ones putting their seals on drawings and letters of assurance, et cetera. So I'm not gonna get involved in that guy's business, et cetera. I'm not gonna tell him what to do. And just the learned behavior, I think, of working on standard projects is really hard to break out of.
I'll throw something else out there, perhaps in answer to your question as well. Part of the dynamic in an IPD project is that there's a big room where people get together, they co-locate, they work through the project. So you're gonna nominate your lead person if you're a mechanical subcontractor, let's say, and I'm the general contractor, and then the architect's gonna put someone, and we all work together in a room. We solve problems on a daily basis. But that also means putting up your hand on a daily basis when you screwed up, because you're threatening that profit pool that's waiting for you at the end of the project. The other thing that I think is also involved is that you have to disclose to all the other people on that project your hard costs for reimbursable expenses. And sometimes people don't like to let that information get out. Sure, it's covered by confidentiality, but that information is pretty sensitive information. So you really have to make yourself vulnerable, right? And does that lead to more skepticism or less skepticism? I don't know. I mean, I never give my rates out in public.
Can I just dive in on the behaviour thing? So within a lot of the behaviours you've talked about relating to this process, encapsulated in the Construction Leadership Council in the UK, have come up with a procuring for value process, and that I mentioned at the beginning of this, and that goes into that co-location in terms of decision making. And on an average project, what we would do at the beginning of that project and see subsequently throughout the project is design sprints with the full design team, where people are genuinely voting on decisions that are being made there and then, and the client is always involved in those meetings. They attend every one of those meetings. So a lot of the language is quite, how do we be more skeptical and how do we be more cynical? Which maybe we need to invert that and just think, well, how do we just work better together, and how can we, I don't want to put an idealist sheen on it, God forbid, but how do we use methods in other industries, get everybody together around the table, and we're starting to build trust between individuals from a sociological standpoint that then sort of transfers into those contractual relationships that go through. And on cost information and cost data, when we're putting together a tendering team, we know who's super expensive and who's going to do a really good job, and we kind of know what their fee's going to be. And we know that if we want to try and undercut on a job, that we might have to go with somebody that's a little bit cheaper, but comes with other troubles. So that information's kind of out there.
Another theory on why not the skepticism and why not the honesty. Well, if the project's been bid upon, it's just that mentality. You just finished the beauty pageant, so nobody wants to then bring up all the bad news. This is really hard to shake out of that and get to where you probably should have been on those early skeptical days.
So I think in terms of a corporate culture, building that corporate culture within a project, in terms of it being safe to put your hand up, and safe not to necessarily question, but go with, what's the best way of doing it collaboratively with that. So instead of you're talking about the language, changing it from negative skeptical to trust and being that, it's okay to put your hand up.
Yeah.
Right?
So it is okay to put your hand up. We have a hand up here in front.
I
Or
got the
sorry.
mic, so I'm going to ask a
Oh,
question.
okay.
So, Chris, you're the first surety professional that we've ever had at one of these events, I would say, on the stage, which is great. It's been my experience that when when the construction industry pursues bonding, they're evaluated on their keeping their overheads low. And everyone in the room here is trying to drive innovation, and they want to do R&D. And it seems to me that maybe that evaluation should include R&D spending or effort to improve, because that could result in improvements. I'm just saying.
Well, it's something. I think it's something positive that can be drawn from the surety industry, in that sureties underwrite bond applicants so heavily, yet that information is all kept confidential because of the sensitivity of it all. But the thing about defaults, quite often a default of a contractor on a project has nothing to do with that project, but it has to do with the prior 4 projects that the contractor got itself closer to the red in, and suddenly they're pulling out of the one that's happening today. So that transparency is something I think that could be learned and adopted. So for instance, owners approaching a contractor to partner with in an IPD, could the culture change so that it would feel appropriate for an owner to say, can we have a look at your financials before we dive into this thing with you? Because the sureties are doing that, and that's just sort of seen as, the industry's always been that way, so they can. And it's invasive, and there's some maybe a bit of an attitude shift that could happen to move that along, and then the transparency is better in the long run, of course.
Hi, my name is Ashley from Alice John, and I've never been on a IPD project, but since we're like a space talking about innovation and BIM, I think that the reason why we're all hopeful for IPD is the implementation of innovation and in BIM. And my question, I'll get to it, but the way I see it is when we are using IPD, it's in order to kind of plan before to kind of leverage technology and innovation to plan prior to actually going into construction. So having that pre-construction phase and having the team around the table to identify, number one, what is our known unknowns? Because there are, when you enter in a project, there are many unknowns. So what are our known unknowns, and how can we use technology to bring light to those unknowns so that they no longer become unknowns? And then there are unknown, which a lot of time is existing conditions and what's underground that you can't really know. You can apply a level of technology to discover what's underground or anything, but you can't really know. So there's so many unknown unknowns, but you can plan and prepare and mainly kind of get rid of the known unknowns. So, and have a plan. So the way I always say is like we're trying to virtually build the building before actually building it, so that we're ready in case of anything, and we have a plan, and then we just adjust to it as we move along to mitigate our risks. Because at the end of the day, we all want to mitigate our risks. So from the designers to GC to even the client. So that's pretty much our hope. And then my question is, in your experience, since you've kind of lived through, you've seen where IPDs have failed. Like, can you share with us where they've failed? Was it because they haven't planned ahead of time? Like, what happened? Like, where? Because I know that, yeah, you can have a small pool of profit. I understand that, and rubber hits the
Road.
Yeah.
No, for sure.
So it's just like, I think that we're so hopeful to implement innovation with so many parties that can bring out a lot. And, it also comes down to transparency, which comes with integrity. So that kind of brings in all that.
Yeah, no, a good question. And just jumping back to my previous answers on that, I mean, my experience is if there's a problem, I've seen a problem with the budget, I've seen inadequate design at the outset, I've seen rogue characters who have their own interests at heart and not necessarily everyone else's interests at heart. The risk of, you're sharing costs, but you've baked profit into your costs, so people are earning out. There's a lot of ways people can try to game the system, that you just don't have the resources, the human capital being invested in the project at the outset, or some people are investing it, but others aren't. Because in an environment where you want things like collaboration to occur, et cetera, if one party is not pulling their weight, it creates frustration and it creates anger, right? And so some of these things are things you can plan for and you can deal with, but others are just things that happen, right? Like people stop, one of the parties is not able to make it to a bunch of meetings, and it frustrates the other people. And it's not because they don't care, they're just too busy, right? Something's come up, et cetera. But it creates an issue, and how do you resolve that? Because if the project has complexity that's unanticipated, that's a major risk. So I mean, BIM is, and you see a lot of articles that talk about how that pair BIM and IPD, like as if BIM is the technology and IPD is the contractual way to deal with this and to deliver this process. And I don't know if that's necessarily true, right? I mean, what is IPD other than, you could have a regular where the owner, a contractual framework where the owner engages their consultants, they do a ton of design, workup, et cetera, and then you simply tender it, right? And you can have your BIM, and you can be a requirement that the contractor simply have to, utilize the technology, et cetera. IPD is buy-in of the contractors into that framework, and also incentivizing the consultants. But you don't need IPD to incentivize consultants. You can do a bespoke system where you're incentivizing your consultants some other way. But all of the things that could go wrong, you can't anticipate them all, right? I don't think you can. But there are many things obvious things, budgeting, good design development, and having all of that in place before you kick off.
Can I just dive in? I mean, one of the observations from the past 48 hours is, it might be an idealistic view, but the application of BIM and information management on projects, all of those three key criteria that you've mentioned about being an issue on a project, they're all human-based. And in actual fact, if you just picked 10 of the amazing things that's going on in this forum and stitched them together and said, well, if there's a problem with design quality and performance, we'll computerize it. We'll make sure we run extra analysis. We've got that sorted. If it's about program delivery, there's loads of 4D modeling application out there. The reason why we're not doing that is because we're trying to sustain an industry that's bloated with too many sub-disciplines, too many parts. And in actual fact, as others are already doing, if we just evidence a very clean process of construction where we have way more control over the supply chain, those problems don't exist as acutely. You don't get over the underground element yet, but the technology has an answer to the rest of it. That's my 2 pence.
So, just looking out if there's any more questions. There's another one? Okay.
Hi, my name is Dragan. I'm with General Contractor, and basically we always come late into the game, correct? Like consultant already build the model and everything else. So what I usually do, I give them 3D model requirements that I require that their model is supposed to have. If their model don't have it, I build it. So then I can compare notes. That's that skepticism and safety net for owner in the same time. So we can go like second set of eyes is better than just one, and I'm going to rely on that. So this is kind of thing that maybe we have to put. Doesn't matter who's going to be chosen down the road to build that building, but to have that protocol that actually designer has to follow, so it falls in place that I, as a general contractor, can use it down the road.
Yeah, it's a really good observation. We do something very, very similar, whereby we have our own set of information requirements that we issue to the rest of the design team, and we will only work with people who agree to work on a similar baseline of information requirements on a project. So very similar, and that's almost, as you say, creating that level of healthy skepticism and agreement of quality to a certain level of information on a project. So I absolutely agree with that approach.
And I'm not with Dragon, but I think what David has really pointed out throughout the thread in this forum here is that, and I've seen in my 30 years, is we've really seen a degradation in the amount of money that's spent on good design. And I hope now we're basically reaching an inflection point, and if lawyers and architects and owners, if we can get more money to the designers, we are going to have better relationships. That's going to solve most of the problems right there.
It's an easy sell in this room, right? Yeah.
Well, is there one more question? No. Okay. I see people moving around underneath the bright lights.
I'm getting there.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Karan Preet. I am from YVR. I had a question. Honestly, even I have not worked on an IPD project, but I have worked on a P3 project. So I was like, I know that IPD is complementary. It's a complementary thing for P3 project. But do you have like anything set criteria, because there are different project models like design, build, and P3 and other. So did you find this specific, like it is complementary for P3, but maybe there's some model it is not suitable? Is there any model, do you think it's not suitable?
I'm sorry, is there any model for which an IPD
any project delivery model that you think like IPD will, at this moment, will not be a good, or we need more effort to push in that model?
Right. Well, IPD is a project delivery model. I mean, when you get right down to it, it's a design, build, collaborative process where the owner is also involved with a profit pool that's shared. And cost of construction is based on reimbursable cost, and profit is deferred into a profit pool. So that kind of covers construction management, design build, and so on. So I think the more fundamental question is whether IPD is right for any individual project. Right? Design build isn't right for every project. P3 isn't right for every project. Construction management at risk isn't right for every project. Lump sum isn't right for every project. I think that's the more fundamental question. So for those of you who are perhaps new to this concept, the CCDC 30, it's out there. You can purchase it through your local construction associations. And it came out in 2018. And my understanding is that there will be a guide published through the CCDC as well that will help explain the concepts so that you can then make your own better informed decisions about whether IPD and CCDC 30 is right for you or for your project.
One comment, though, on that, just to add to that, Paul, is I think for an owner, when they're deciding if they want P3 or design build or whatever, it's for some owners who don't have the staff, the capability, and just want to offload all risk, IPD is a bad idea, right? Because IPD, you are taking risk as an owner, right? If you're and you're involved. You're involved, right? You know, if you come in under budget, the owner benefits from that, right? They're not simply walking away. They get to share in part of the retained contingency. They retain some of that. But if you're an owner that, you know, and I think for governments, why hospitals and schools are often built by, or more commonly with IPD, is because of the owner. The owner is it's a hospital board. They don't have a team of contractor-minded professionals, perhaps, right? That they don't have the resources, and they just want to, you know, turn it over to someone, or excuse me, flipping, they have that team. But if you don't have the team and you simply just want a contractor to build it, design build, or even, and a P3 is just a version of a design build, really. So, yeah.